A gavel cracks, shattering the illusion of a perfect aristocratic life. This is the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the human price paid for a title in the Gilded Age. In an era of staggering fortunes and suffocating social rules, she was America's richest heiress, transformed into a British Duchess, and finally, a divorced woman fighting for her freedom. You will uncover the true cost of a life traded for power and prestige. We will explore how a mother's ambition built a gilded cage and what it took for a daughter to finally break free. What does it mean to be both a prize and a prisoner? The foundation of Consuelo's gilded cage was forged not in English castles, but on American rivers and railways. It began with a single ferry boat. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man of ferocious will and little formal education, started with that one boat in New York Harbor and built a colossal empire. He was ruthless, swallowing up competitors in the shipping industry before pivoting to an even greater prize, the railroads. His genius and relentless drive laid tracks of steel and commerce across the nation, amassing a fortune so vast it was almost incomprehensible. By the time he died, he was the richest man in America. This staggering wealth passed to his grandson, William Kissam Vanderbilt, Consuelo's father. He inherited not just millions, but a name synonymous with raw industrial power. And that was the problem. In the eyes of New York's old guard, the Vanderbilts were still new money. Their wealth was too recent, too loud, too earned from the gritty world of business. They lived in breathtaking mansions along Fifth Avenue, palaces filled with European art and gilded furniture. Yet they were socially ostracized by families who had made their fortunes generations earlier. This rejection bred a deep, burning desire for legitimacy, for a status that mere money could not buy. For Consuelo, this family yearning would dictate her entire life. That unimaginable fortune, which provided every material comfort, also painted a target on her back. She was not just a young woman, she was the primary asset in her family's quest for acceptance. Her upbringing, her education, her very existence were all curated for one purpose: to be the perfect offering in the transatlantic marriage market, a priceless commodity traded for a title and a seat at the oldest tables in the world. The architect of this gilded cage was a woman of iron will and boundless ambition, Alva Vanderbilt. Having married into the Vanderbilt fortune herself, Alva understood that money alone was not enough. She was locked in a silent, brutal war for social dominance, and her greatest rival was the undisputed queen of New York society, Carolina Store, Mrs. A Store presided over the city's elite with an iron fist, and she famously looked down on the Vanderbilts as vulgar newcomers. Alva would not be ignored. She commissioned the construction of a Newport cottage she named Marble House, a palace of such staggering opulence it was designed to shock and awe the very society that shunned her. It was not a home, it was a declaration of war, built with over $500,000 worth of marble alone. Every gilded ceiling, every imported tapestry was a calculated move in her campaign for acceptance. And her ultimate weapon in this war was not a building, but her own daughter, Consuelo. From the moment Consuelo could walk, Alva molded her into the perfect aristocratic bride. Her education was rigorous, her posture was constantly corrected, and her every movement was scrutinized. She was dressed in fine clothes, yet isolated from the world, kept away from other children to ensure no unsuitable attachments could form. Consuelo was not being raised as a person. She was being polished into a masterpiece, a flawless jewel to be presented at the altar of European nobility. Alva's ambition became the central, inescapable fact of Consuelo's young life. Her mother's desire for a title was a force of nature, a hurricane that flattened every one of Consuelo's own hopes and dreams. The stage was now set for a collision between a mother's ruthless social strategy and a daughter's yearning for a life of her own. Her world was a palace of marble, but her life was a prison of routine. Each day for young Consuelo Vanderbilt began and ended with a singular, unwavering purpose: to be sculpted into a duchess. Her childhood was a paradox of immense privilege and profound loneliness, a gilded existence where every minute was scheduled and every action was critiqued. From the moment she woke, her hours were filled with a relentless curriculum of etiquette, French, and aristocratic manners. She learned to walk with a book balanced on her head, to curtsy with impossible grace, and to make polite, empty conversation with imaginary dignitaries. There was no time for frivolous play or simple friendships. For her mother, Alva, viewed such ordinary pleasures as threats to a perfectly polished future. The goal was not to raise a happy child, but to forge a human key that would unlock the doors of European high society. This psychological preparation was brutal in its precision. To combat a natural tendency to slouch, Alva resorted to shocking measures. She had a painful steel rod strapped to her daughter's back, a constant, rigid reminder of the perfect posture required of a noble woman. At night, the control did not cease. Alva would sometimes tie the young girl to her bed, ensuring she slept flat on her back without moving, all to prevent any imperfection in her spine. These were not acts of cruelty in Alva's mind, but necessary investments. Every moment of discomfort was a down payment on a coronet. Consuelo learned to suppress her own will, to silence her own voice, becoming an exquisitely beautiful and impeccably mannered automaton. She was being conditioned to accept that her body, her mind, and her future were not her own. How does a person learn to breathe when their entire life is spent in a cage designed by someone else's ambition? The final chilling step in this grand design was just over the horizon, a courtship that was less a romance and more a corporate merger between American wealth and British aristocracy. Across the Atlantic, the man who embodied Alva Vanderbilt's ultimate ambition was facing a financial crisis of his own. He was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. His title was one of the most illustrious in all of England, a name resonant with military glory and political power, tracing back to his famous ancestor, the first Duke who led armies to victory. But that glorious title came with an immense and crumbling burden: Blenheim Palace. This was not merely a house. It was a monumental Baroque masterpiece, a gift from a grateful nation to his ancestor. Its vast halls and hundreds of rooms were a symbol of a family's historic importance. But by the 1890s, it was a white elephant sinking under its own weight. The roof leaked, the stonework was decaying, and the cost of upkeep was astronomical. The Duke was a man trapped by his own inheritance, the proud owner of a palace he could not afford to heat, a living relic in a world that was rapidly changing. His ancient, fading aristocratic world, built on land and lineage, was being overtaken by a new kind of power, the raw, industrial wealth of America. He was not looking for love. He was searching for a rescue mission, a massive infusion of cash to restore his family's estate and secure its future. And in the vibrant new wealth of the Vanderbilts, he saw his only viable solution. Here was the perfect, if uncomfortable, equation. An American fortune needed a respectable old name to gain social legitimacy, and an old English name needed a massive American fortune to avoid collapsing into ruin. Into this calculated transaction, a young woman named Consuelo was about to be delivered. The negotiations for Consuelo's hand were conducted with the cold precision of a corporate takeover. Alva Vanderbilt, the master strategist, sat across from the Duke of Marlborough, and the subject was not love or compatibility, but assets and liquidity. The primary asset on the table was the Vanderbilt fortune, and the Duke's liquidity problem was his crumbling palace. In exchange for his title and name, Alva secured an agreement that was staggering in its scale. Consuelo's dowry was set at $2.5 million in railroad stock, a sum equivalent to over $75 million today. This was not a gift. It was a capital investment, a direct infusion of cash intended to rescue Blenheim from decay and restore its grandeur. But the deal did not end there. The Duke also secured for himself a massive annual allowance, a personal income drawn from the Vanderbilt millions to fund his life as a restored aristocrat. Every detail was meticulously planned, leaving nothing to chance or emotion. This was a transaction that perfectly encapsulated the Gilded Age, a merger between new American industrial money and old British aristocratic lineage. Consuelo herself was the chief asset being traded. Her youth, her beauty, and her breeding the final components in a business deal that would secure her mother's social victory and save a duke from financial ruin. The human heart was the one item not listed on any contract. How do you put a price on a person's entire future? For Alva and the Duke, the answer was simple: you just did. And with the terms settled, the only thing left was to present the bride with her prearranged destiny. The final act of persuasion was a masterpiece of emotional terrorism. Consuelo, barely 18, was summoned to her mother's private rooms. Alva did not request her daughter's compliance. She demanded it. She presented the Duke's proposal as a foregone conclusion, the triumphant culmination of years of sacrifice and training. But when Consuelo, her voice trembling, attempted to voice a refusal, Alva unleashed her most potent weapon. She collapsed, gasping for breath, clutching her chest. She declared that Consuelo's disobedience was killing her, that the stress was triggering a fatal heart attack. Through dramatic sobs, Alva swore that if her daughter refused this brilliant match, she would be dead to her forever. She would sever all ties, never look upon her daughter's face again. This was not a negotiation. It was a brutal ultimatum wrapped in the guise of a maternal deathbed scene. The gilded cage had finally slammed shut, its lock forged from guilt and the terrifying threat of absolute abandonment. What choice did a young woman, raised in total obedience, truly have? The most heartbreaking layer of this coercion was the secret Consuelo was forced to bury. She was not simply rejecting a stranger. she was being forced to renounce the man she truly loved. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, a handsome and well-regarded American socialite. Their affection for each other was genuine and mutual, a tender connection that represented everything her mother's plan destroyed, a life chosen for love. Alva had discovered the budding romance and had ruthlessly quashed it, deeming Rutherford an insufficient prize for a Vanderbilt heiress. Now, with her mother's performative illness as the backdrop, Consuelo was ordered to write a letter to Winthrop, formally ending their relationship. She had to break her own heart with her own hand, scripting the words that severed her last tie to personal happiness. The engagement to the Duke was announced to a cheering society, a glittering fairy tale for the newspapers. But behind the dazzling diamond ring and the public smiles, a profound emotional violence had taken place. The transaction was complete. The prize had been secured, but the human cost was a young woman's spirit, shattered under the weight of a mother's ambition. On a cold November morning in 1895, New York City came to a standstill. Thousands of people clogged the streets around St. Thomas Episcopal Church, a pulsing, eager mob straining for a glimpse of the bride. This was not just a wedding, it was the social event of the Gilded Age, a spectacular pageant of wealth and status. Inside, the church was a forest of orchids and lilies, their heavy perfume filling the air. The guest list was a who is who of American high society, all there to witness the Vanderbilt family's ultimate triumph. The bride's trousseau was the talk of the nation, a collection of gowns and jewels so vast and expensive it filled entire newspaper columns. And then there was the dress, a creation of silver tissue and satin, trimmed with priceless antique lace, a garment that shimmered like a mirage as Consuelo walked down the aisle. But beneath the veil of this fairy tale was a heartbreaking reality. Consuelo was weeping. She cried so uncontrollably that the thick lace could not hide her distress. Her body shook with silent sobs, her legs nearly buckling under the weight of her gown and her despair. The ushers flanking her had to physically support her, holding her upright as she was escorted toward a man she barely knew. That image, a bride being propped up on her way to the altar, is the perfect, painful metaphor for her entire marriage to come. It was a beautiful facade, an exquisite performance for the public, all masking a profound and devastating misery. The spectacle was flawless, but the human being at its center was already breaking. Her new home was a kingdom of stone and silence. Blenheim Palace was not merely a house. It was an overwhelming statement of power and history, a sprawling Baroque masterpiece with 200 rooms set within thousands of acres of parkland. To the outside world, it was breathtaking, a monument to the Churchill family's glory. For Consuelo, it was a beautiful, echoing prison. The sheer scale of it was inhuman, its endless corridors and cavernous staterooms designed to impress visitors, not to comfort a lonely young woman. In the winter, the cold was a living presence, seeping through the ancient window frames and swirling across the vast marble floors. Drafts whispered through grand halls, and entire wings stood empty and shrouded in dust sheets, too expensive to heat. She would often wear a fur coat indoors, just to feel some semblance of warmth. The palace was a museum, and she was its newest, most isolated exhibit. Her days fell into a rigid, suffocating pattern dictated by centuries of aristocratic tradition. Every meal was a formal ceremony. every social call a test of etiquette. She was expected to manage a small army of servants, host lavish weekend parties for dozens of guests, and always maintain the flawless facade of a happy duchess. The pressure was relentless, a constant performance for a husband who viewed her not as a partner, but as a necessary component of his restored estate. Her greatest duty, the one repeated to her like a mantra, was to produce an heir. Her value, in the eyes of her husband and the entire British aristocracy, hinged on her ability to secure the Marlborough line. In this grand and gloomy existence, she was profoundly alone, an American stranger in a world governed by rules she had only ever studied from a distance. How do you build a life when you are treated as a function rather than a person? The birth of a son would fulfill her contract, but it would do nothing to warm the cold, magnificent halls of her new home. Their marriage was a beautiful, empty shell. Inside the magnificent walls of Blenheim Palace, Consuelo and the Duke lived as two solitary figures inhabiting the same vast museum. They were fundamentally incompatible in almost every way. Consuelo possessed a lively, curious mind, shaped by her modern American upbringing. She was deeply interested in the world, in ideas, in people. The Duke, by contrast, was a product of a fading aristocratic tradition, reserved, formal, and emotionally distant. His primary passions were his estate, his political career, and the preservation of his lineage, not the emotional needs of a young wife he had married for her fortune. Their conversations were largely limited to the management of the household or their social obligations, a far cry from the companionship Consuelo had secretly, desperately hoped to find. This emotional chasm was made physically permanent by the architecture of their lives. They maintained entirely separate bedrooms, a common arrangement in aristocratic marriages of convenience. But for Consuelo, it was a daily reminder of her profound loneliness. It was not just about a lack of intimacy. It was a symbol of their completely separate existences under one enormous roof. He had his pursuits, and she had hers, and their paths crossed mainly at formal dinners and public events, where they performed the roles of a happy, noble couple for their guests. To compound her isolation, there were the persistent and painful rumors of the Duke's infidelities. He was said to have taken a long-term mistress, a former flame named Gladys Deacon, an American beauty who would eventually become a constant, unsettling presence in their social circle. For Consuelo, this was the ultimate betrayal, not of love, for love had never been part of their contract, but of basic respect and dignity. It confirmed her status as a purchased asset, a breeding vessel who had served her primary purpose by providing the required heir. Her husband's affections, what few he showed, were directed elsewhere, leaving her utterly alone in her gilded prison. How does a woman survive when she is surrounded by splendor but starved for a single genuine connection? Her only solace would be found not in her husband's company, but in the small, quiet acts of rebellion she began to cultivate for herself. Yet within that cold and lonely existence, one duty burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The entire foundation of her marriage, the very reason for the Vanderbilt millions flowing into Blenheim's restoration, depended entirely on Consuelo fulfilling one biological imperative. She had to produce a son. The pressure was not merely a family expectation, it was a national and financial one. the continuation of the Marlborough title, the securing of the dynasty, and the justification of her own enormous dowry all rested on her shoulders. Her value as a duchess was quantifiable, and it was measured in a male heir. When she gave birth to her first son, John, the Marquess of Blandford, in 1897, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the palace corridors. The direct line was secure. The primary objective of the entire transaction had been met, but in the ruthless arithmetic of aristocracy, one son was a risk. What if some childhood illness, some unforeseen tragedy were to strike? The lineage required a backup, an insurance policy. So came the birth of a second son, Ivor, in 1898. He was the so-called spare, the final guarantee that the Vanderbilt investment would not be wasted. With the arrival of these two boys, Consuelo had done it. She had delivered the heir and the spare. In the eyes of her husband and of society, her most vital function was now complete. In this completion, this final checkmark on the list of her wifely duties, created a paradoxical and unexpected result. It began to crack open a door just slightly to a life of her own. The relentless pressure to perform her primary role had finally eased. Now she could point to her success as a mother of the heir as a form of social capital, a justification for turning her attention elsewhere. She began to channel her immense energy and intelligence into causes that actually stirred her soul. She involved herself in philanthropy, in social reform, in the world beyond Blenheim's gilded gates. The very duty that had once confined her now became her passport to a small measure of freedom. How strange that the fulfillment of her contractual obligation would become the first step on her long road back to herself. But the rigid world of Blenheim could not contain her forever. A new purpose began to stir within Consuelo, one that reached far beyond the palace walls. Influenced by the progressive ideas of her time and by her friendship with her husband's charismatic cousin, Winston Churchill, her perspective began to shift dramatically. Churchill, though a staunch defender of the British Empire, was a man of formidable intellect and curiosity, and his conversations with Consuelo opened her eyes to the political and social currents shaping the modern world. She started to see the profound contrast between the immense wealth she represented and the grinding poverty that afflicted so many in England. This was not an abstract concept for her. She went out and saw it for herself. She visited the cramped, soot-stained tenements of London's slums and the struggling rural villages on the edges of her own estate. The experience was a revelation. Here was a form of suffering that her perfect etiquette and flawless posture could not possibly address. And so, the decorative Duchess decided to become a working one. She rolled up her sleeves and immersed herself in philanthropy with the same discipline her mother had once applied to her training. She became a passionate advocate for women's suffrage, recognizing that without political power, women would remain trapped in lives dictated by others, a truth she understood all too personally. She used her title and her social influence not for parties, but for progress, establishing schools to educate poor children and funding hospitals to provide medical care for those who could not afford it. For the first time in her adult life, she was not merely fulfilling a duty assigned to her. She was following her own moral compass. This work gave her something her title and her wealth never could: a genuine sense of purpose and an identity that was entirely her own making. She was no longer just the Duchess of Marlborough. She was Consuelo, a woman who could make a difference. How does a person who has been treated as an object reclaim their own agency? They find a cause greater than themselves, and in helping others, they finally learn how to save themselves. The world only saw the glittering performance. At the coronation of King Edward VII, Consuelo stood beside the Duke, a vision of aristocratic perfection in her diamonds and silks. They hosted weekend parties at Blenheim so extravagant they became the stuff of legend, with dozens of titled guests, endless courses of food and entertainment on a royal scale. In public, they were the ideal couple, the beautiful American Duchess and her distinguished husband, the living embodiment of a successful transatlantic alliance. They smiled for the cameras, exchanged pleasantries with royalty, and presented a facade of perfect unity to a watching world. But the moment the last guest departed and the great doors of Blenheim closed, the performance ended. The silence that descended was not peaceful. It was heavy with resentment. Their private life became a battleground fought in whispers and cold stares within those palatial rooms. The very independence that gave Consuelo purpose became a source of fierce conflict. The Duke watched her growing popularity with a simmering jealousy. He saw how she charmed their guests, how her philanthropic work earned her public admiration, and he deeply resented that she was no longer the pliable, controlled girl he had married. He had purchased a decorative asset, and she was transforming into an influential figure in her own right. Their arguments grew more frequent and more bitter, not loud shouting matches, but the kind of sharp, polite barbs that leave deeper wounds. He criticized her modern ideas, her friends, her very manner. She, in turn, withdrew further, finding his traditionalism stifling and his emotional coldness unbearable. The gulf between them became an ocean they could no longer cross. The final, unspoken treaty in their silent war was a decision to live entirely separate lives. They maintained the public illusion, appearing together at obligatory functions, but within Blenheim, they inhabited different worlds. They took meals apart, pursued separate schedules, and communicated through servants when necessary. The 200-room palace, once a symbol of their union, became the perfect container for their estrangement, large enough for two people to live for years without ever truly meeting. How long can a beautiful facade stand when the foundation beneath it has turned to dust? Ironically, the person who became Consuelo's most powerful advocate was the very same one who had built her prison. Alva Vanderbilt had undergone a revolution of her own. After her very public and scandalous divorce from William K. Vanderbilt, she had not faded into obscurity. Instead, she had reinvented herself as Alva Belmont, a formidable and wealthy leader in the American women's suffrage movement. She had stormed the male-dominated world of politics, organizing marches, funding campaigns, and using her social savvy to fight for the very right she had denied her own daughter, the right to self-determination. This radical transformation forced her to confront the profound hypocrisy of her past actions. The woman who had once traded her daughter for a title was now shouting from soapboxes that no woman should be a man's property. And in this new, hard-won clarity, she looked across the Atlantic at her daughter's miserable existence and was filled with a storm of regret. The social ambition that had once blinded her had been replaced by a fierce, protective feminism. She began writing to Consuelo, not with demands, but with support. She affirmed that her daughter's unhappiness was valid, that a life of quiet desperation was not a fate to be endured. Most importantly, she gave Consuelo the one thing she had withheld years before: her permission to leave. Alva used her considerable resources and legal knowledge to actively guide Consuelo through the daunting prospect of a divorce, a scandalous act for a duchess in that era. She assured her that she would not face this battle alone, that the full weight of the Vanderbilt fortune and influence would now be used to liberate her, not to bind her. The mother who had once orchestrated a marriage of convenience was now masterminding its dissolution. How does someone atone for such a monumental mistake? For Alva, the answer was to dismantle with her own hands the gilded cage she had so carefully constructed. The silence between them finally broke into a public earthquake. In 1906, the formal separation of the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough was announced, and the shockwaves reverberated from the halls of Blenheim Palace to the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. For a society built on the illusion of perfect unions, this was more than gossip. It was a crack in the very foundation of their world. A duchess was not supposed to leave her duke. The act was a scandal of the highest order, a public admission that the beautiful fairy tale had been a lie all along. Whispers followed Consuelo everywhere, a chorus of judgment and morbid curiosity. She was pitied by some, vilified by others, but rarely understood. The price of her step toward freedom was her reputation, and there was an even more painful cost, one that tore at her heart every single day. To establish her own life, she had to leave her two young sons, John and Ivor, behind at Blenheim for long periods. In the eyes of the law and of society, they were the heirs to the Marlborough title, and their primary home was with their father. The choice was agonizing, a cruel trade of one form of love for another, her freedom for her children. For the Duke, this separation was a financial nightmare cloaked in social disgrace. The Vanderbilt fortune that had rescued his estate and funded his lifestyle was now in jeopardy. The generous annual allowance he received was tied directly to his marriage. With Consuelo gone, that river of gold could very well dry up. He was facing the terrifying prospect of returning to the very insolvency her dowry had solved, all while his estranged wife was becoming a celebrated and sympathetic figure. Their private misery was now a very public business dispute, a cold war over money, children, and the shattered remains of a gilded cage. The legal machinery of her liberation would turn slowly, grinding through the gears of English law for 15 long years. A divorce in the early 20th century was not a simple matter of irreconcilable differences. It was a rare and scandalous act, a public admission of failure that could shatter a family's reputation forever. For the aristocracy, it was almost unthinkable, a breach of the unwritten contract that held their privileged world together. A duchess simply did not get divorced. To even begin the process, one party had to be proven guilty of a serious matrimonial offense. The most common and most socially acceptable ground was adultery. And so a quiet, strategic campaign began. The Duke's long-standing relationship with Gladys Deacon, once a source of private humiliation for Consuelo, now became her legal key to freedom. Evidence of his infidelity had to be gathered with discretion, not to provoke a duel or a public feud, but to build an unassailable case in the cold eyes of the court. Every step was calculated to minimize the blast radius of the scandal. They lived separately, they avoided public confrontations, and their lawyers worked behind the scenes to negotiate the terms of their rupture like diplomats, ending a weary war. The goal was not to destroy each other, but to secure a dissolution that would allow them both to survive socially, even if their reputations were permanently tarnished. It was a delicate dance on a tightrope, stretched over an abyss of disgrace. Could a transaction built on cold calculation be undone with that same clinical precision? The final decree would not be granted until 1921, a testament to the immense social and legal barriers they had to patiently, painfully dismantle. Finally, after 15 years of separation and a lifetime of obedience, the decree was granted. On a summer day in 1921, the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough was officially dissolved. The legal document was a simple piece of paper, but for Consuelo, it represented a profound and hard-won liberation. Imagine the dizzying mix of emotions that must have washed over her, a soaring relief that the long performance was over, tempered by the heavy knowledge of the societal judgment that would surely follow. She was free, but she was now a divorced woman in an era that still viewed such a status with deep suspicion. The terms of her freedom were as complex as the marriage contract that had bound her. Her divorce settlement was a meticulous disentanglement of Vanderbilt wealth from Marlborough lineage, while she received a substantial financial settlement to ensure her independence. The intricate web of trusts and allowances that had once funded the Duke's life and the Blenheim estate were carefully unwoven. She was no longer a financial lifeline for a palace she no longer called home. This legal severance was the final, formal act in closing a tragic chapter written by others. The gilded cage door was not just open, it was dismantled. For the first time since she was a girl, her life was her own to author. What does a woman do with a freedom she was never supposed to have? She begins again. Freedom tasted like the crisp air over the French countryside. For the first time, Consuelo Vanderbilt was no longer a duchess bound by duty, but simply a woman in charge of her own destiny. Her second act began not with a title, but with a genuine connection. She married Jacques Balsan, a charming and pioneering French aviator and engineer. This was not a transaction. It was a partnership built on a foundation of shared interests and deep, abiding affection. Jacques admired her for her mind and her spirit, not her bank balance. He was a man of action and modernity, a world away from the stuffy traditions of Blenheim Palace. With him, Consuelo discovered the simple, profound joy of a shared life, of conversations that lasted for the pleasure of it, and of a love that asked for nothing but her true self. This hard-won happiness did not make her retreat from the world. It empowered her to engage with it more fully on her own terms. She continued her philanthropic work with renewed vigor, supporting aviation charities that aligned with Jacques' passions and advancing the causes for women and children she had long championed. She also discovered a new voice as a writer, penning her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. In its pages, she finally told her own story, not as a society scandal, but as a quiet testimony of a woman navigating a world of gilded expectations. It was a measured and graceful reclaiming of her own narrative. Her life now flowed gracefully between two worlds. She maintained a beautiful home in the United States and a chateau in France, effortlessly bridging the continents that had once defined her conflict. She was no longer an American heiress forced into a British mold, but a citizen of the world by choice. In this final chapter, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson crafted an existence that was rich with purpose, love, and autonomy. The woman who had been traded for a palace finally built a home for herself, not out of marble and stone, but out of freedom and fulfillment. How does a story that began with such profound loss ultimately find its happy ending? It happens when the protagonist finally seizes the pen and begins to write it for herself. The Duke of Marlborough had secured his palace, but he had lost his Duchess. With the Vanderbilt fortune, he accomplished his primary mission, the magnificent restoration of Blenheim. The leaking roofs were sealed, the crumbling stonework was repaired, and the grand staterooms once again gleamed with their former Baroque glory. He had saved his ancestral home, the very embodiment of his family's legacy. Yet the man who walked those refurbished halls was profoundly alone, his life a monument to a hollow victory. The financial salvation came at an immense personal price, leaving him isolated within the very walls he had fought so hard to preserve. Just 2 years after the divorce was finalized, he married his longtime companion, Gladys Deacon. She was another American beauty, an intellectual and artistic woman who had once been considered a great beauty of her age. On the surface, it seemed he had finally found a partner of his own choosing. But this second marriage quickly curdled into something even more toxic than the first. Gladys was a volatile and increasingly eccentric figure, her own ambitions and sharp intellect clashing violently with the Duke's rigid traditionalism. Their relationship descended into bitter public acrimony. They argued ferociously, often in front of stunned guests, and eventually they retreated to live in entirely separate wings of the enormous palace, communicating only through written notes passed by servants. The union became so broken that the Duke even went so far as to have the striking cerulean blue pigment of her eyes surgically removed from her official portrait, hanging in the palace, a chilling act of erasure. He had traded one unhappy marriage for another, proving that the simple acquisition of a new wife could not solve the deeper emptiness of a life lived for duty and dynasty above all else. His existence remained permanently defined by the need for wealth, first to acquire it, and then to manage the complex emotional fallout from that transaction. He achieved his material goal, but the cost was a lifetime of solitude, a king in a castle that had become his own beautifully appointed prison. What does it profit a man to save his palace if he loses his soul in the process? Her greatest heartbreak was a quiet one, the echoing absence of her sons. After the divorce, Consuelo's relationship with John and Ivor was defined by distance and the rigid expectations of their world. They were the heirs to Blenheim, and their primary residence remained with their father, a fact dictated by aristocratic tradition and the unyielding legal norms of the era. Consuelo was now a visitor in their lives, a beloved figure who arrived for holidays and scheduled visits, her motherhood conducted across the chasm of separation. She had fought for her own freedom, but that victory came with the agonizing price of not tucking her boys into bed each night, of missing the small, daily triumphs and struggles that build a childhood. This was a pain far deeper than any social scandal, a constant, dull ache she carried with her even as she built her new life. Yet this very distance fueled a profound determination in her. She was resolved that her sons would never feel the oppressive weight of expectation that had crushed her own spirit. Her parenting became a conscious rebellion against the blueprint her mother, Alva, had provided. Where Alva had controlled, Consuelo sought to understand. Where Alva had demanded obedience, Consuelo offered unwavering support. She knew intimately the damage a gilded cage could inflict, and she was fiercely committed to leaving the door to her children's lives wide open. Her love was not a force of will, but a steady, constant presence, assuring them they were valued for who they were, not for the titles they would one day inherit. She encouraged their individual interests, listened to their dreams, and provided a haven of emotional warmth that stood in stark contrast to the formal, chilly atmosphere of Blenheim Palace. How does a mother heal the wounds of her own childhood? Often, she does it by ensuring her children never have to bear those same scars. Throughout their lives, this foundation of mutual respect and affection held firm. Both John, who would become the 10th Duke, and Ivor maintained close, loving bonds with their mother. They visited her frequently in her homes in France and America, and she remained their most trusted confidante. In an era when aristocratic sons were often emotionally remote from their parents, particularly their mothers, the connection Consuelo fostered with her boys was remarkably modern and deeply genuine. Her legacy was not just one of escaped tragedy, but of a love that transcended the confines of tradition, proving that the most powerful inheritance a parent can give a child is not a title or a fortune, but the freedom to be truly known and loved. She finally held the pen. In 1953, decades after her divorce and with a happy second marriage behind her, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. For a woman of her generation and exalted social standing, this was an act of profound courage. It was not merely reminiscing, it was a reclamation. She was seizing control of a narrative that had been written for her by others, by newspaper gossip columns, and by the silent expectations of high society. The title itself was a perfect summary of her life, a life that had glittered with unimaginable wealth and titles, but one where the true value, the gold of personal happiness, had been painfully absent for so long. In its pages, she did something extraordinary for a duchess. She told the truth. She confirmed, in her own graceful and measured prose, the rumors that had swirled for half a century. She detailed the relentless pressure from her mother, Alva, describing the emotional blackmail and the fabricated heart attack that forced her to accept the Duke's proposal. She spoke of the steel rod strapped to her back and the crushing loneliness of her gilded upbringing. Most devastatingly, she wrote of the man she truly loved, Winthrop Rutherford, in the heartbreaking letter she was compelled to write, severing their relationship with her own hand. This was not a bitter tell-all, but a quiet, dignified testimony. The public and the press were captivated. For the first time, people heard the story not as a society scandal, but from the heart of the woman who had lived it. The book became a bestseller, offering an intimate, unvarnished look behind the gilded curtain of aristocracy. Readers were mesmerized by her account of the cold grandeur of Blenheim Palace and the emotional desolation of a marriage that was, from its very first day, a business arrangement. The reaction was a mixture of shock, sympathy, and a newfound respect for her resilience. Here was a woman who had fulfilled every duty demanded of her, and then, with quiet determination, had found the strength to build a life of meaning on her own terms. By sharing her story, she gave a voice to countless other women who had felt trapped by circumstance, showing them that even the most gilded cage has a key, if one is brave enough to look for it. What is the ultimate act of freedom for someone who has been silenced? It is to finally speak. Consuelo Vanderbilt was far from alone in her gilded exile. Her personal tragedy was, in fact, a single chapter in a vast social ledger known as the transatlantic marriage market. During the Gilded Age, a quiet invasion of American wealth swept through the ancient halls of British aristocracy. These young women were dubbed the dollar princesses, or sometimes, more bluntly, the billion brides. They were the human currency in a straightforward economic exchange. Their massive dowries traded for ancient titles that were fading from a lack of funds. Think of it as a grand, unspoken bailout for the crumbling European nobility, financed by the industrial fortunes of the New World. It was a trend so pervasive it reshaped the British peerage itself. One of the most famous pioneers of this path was Jenny Jerome, a dazzling American beauty who, 2 decades before Consuelo, married Lord Randolph Churchill. Her father's fortune, built on Wall Street speculation, helped fund her husband's political ascent and, most notably, the upbringing of their brilliant son, Winston. Yet even Jenny, who entered her marriage for love, found herself constrained by the strictures of British society and a husband whose political career was cut short by illness. Her story, while different in its beginnings, still highlights the complex pressures these women faced. They were expected to replenish aristocratic coffers, produce male heirs, and navigate a foreign culture with flawless grace, all while being viewed with a mixture of gratitude and thinly veiled contempt for their new money origins. For every Jenny Jerome who managed to carve out a sphere of influence, there were countless others who lived out their days in quiet desperation, stranded in damp castles, separated from their families by an ocean, and trapped in marriages as cold and formal as the stone portraits lining their husbands' ancestral halls. Why did this specific form of social commerce flourish at this precise moment in history? The answer lies in a perfect storm of ambition and desperation. In America, titans of industry like the Vanderbilts and the Astors had more money than they could possibly spend, but they lacked the one thing they could not manufacture: social legitimacy. In Britain, the aristocracy possessed centuries of lineage and titles that commanded respect, but their vast estates were becoming financial anchors, dragging them into insolvency. A marriage between the two solved both problems with brutal efficiency. It was a transaction that seemed to make perfect sense on a balance sheet, but it completely ignored the human heart at the center of the deal. These young women, raised in relative freedom and modernity, were shipped off to become living, breathing restoration projects for a dying way of life. They were the ultimate luxury import, purchased to prop up a system that was already a relic. So while Consuelo's story is uniquely poignant in its details, her fate was a shared one. She was one of many diamonds, polished to a brilliant shine in New York and Newport, only to be set into the tarnished crowns of a nobility that needed their wealth far more than it wanted their love. Consuelo Vanderbilt's life was more than a personal tragedy. It was a perfect mirror reflecting the deep fractures of the Gilded Age itself. This era, glittering with new fortunes and technological marvels, was built upon a foundation of profound inequality. While families like the Vanderbilts dined in marble palaces on Fifth Avenue, countless laborers worked 12-hour days in dangerous factories for a pittance. The same railroad stocks that funded Consuelo's dowry were built by workers living in squalid shantytowns, their lives a world apart from the opulence their labor produced. This was the central contradiction of the age, an unprecedented concentration of wealth existing alongside desperate, widespread poverty. It was a world where a single ball gown could cost more than a factory worker earned in a lifetime, and where the restoration of one English palace required a fortune larger than the annual budgets of many American towns. The gilding was dazzling, but it was applied over a core of social and economic strife. How could such a society sustain its own magnificent fiction? The answer lay in an unyielding social hierarchy, a rigid set of rules designed to keep everyone in their assigned place. For the working class, this meant a life of limited mobility and back-breaking toil. For the new industrial elite, it meant a frantic, often humiliating, scramble for acceptance from an old guard that secretly despised them. And for women, the rules were perhaps the most confining of all. They were the currency of social advancement, their lives dictated by a single, narrow purpose. A woman like Alva Vanderbilt could wield immense power, but only by mastering the brutal game of social climbing, using her daughter as the ultimate pawn to secure a victory that was ultimately hollow. A woman like Consuelo was raised for one role alone, to be a beautiful, obedient vessel for transferring wealth and producing heirs. There was no room in this grand design for a woman's own dreams, her intellect, or her desire for love. She was a decorative object, a symbol of her family's success, but never the author of her own story. The pressure to conform to these roles was immense and inescapable, a psychological cage as real as any physical one. So when we look back at the Gilded Age, with its magnificent mansions and extravagant balls, we must also see the human cost of that glitter. We must ask what was lost in the frantic pursuit of status and stability. How many other young women, whose names are lost to history, had their spirits crushed under the weight of similar expectations? The true legacy of this era is not just one of opulence and innovation, but also of silent sacrifices and quiet rebellions. Consuelo's eventual escape was a radical act that questioned the very foundations of the world that created her. Her life forces us to reckon with a difficult question: can any amount of gold ever be worth the price of a human soul? Her final years were a quiet testament to a life reclaimed. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson did not fade into the background of history as a tragic duchess. She evolved into a respected elder, a woman who had not only survived her gilded captivity, but had transformed it into a platform for genuine purpose. She is remembered not for the title she was forced to bear, but for the woman she chose to become. Her legacy extends far beyond the scandal of her divorce, rooted instead in the schools she helped build, the hospitals she funded, and her unwavering advocacy for women's right to vote. She had turned the vast Vanderbilt wealth, the very instrument of her confinement, into a powerful tool for social good, channeling it toward causes that alleviated suffering and expanded opportunity for others. This work gave her a fulfillment that being the mistress of Blenheim Palace never could. It was a resilience forged in the fires of personal experience, a deep understanding of what it meant to be trapped by circumstances, and a determination to help others find their own doors to freedom. Her life became a powerful argument for self-determination, a narrative of transformation that resonates even today. How do we measure the impact of a single life? For Consuelo, the measurement is not in the palaces she inhabited, but in the lives she touched through her compassion and her courage. She demonstrated that even the most scripted story can be rewritten, and that the greatest triumph is not in the glitter one is given, but in the gold one forges for oneself. Consuelo Vanderbilt's journey is an epic of quiet rebellion. She began as a controlled heiress, a polished asset in her mother's ruthless social campaign. She became an unhappy duchess, a beautiful ornament in a cold and lonely palace. But her story did not end there. She ultimately emerged as a liberated and self-determined woman, a person who finally seized the pen to write her own life's final chapters. Her heartbreaking and triumphant path forces us to confront the perils of treating people as commodities, of reducing a human soul to a line on a balance sheet. It reveals the crushing weight of social expectation, the immense pressure to conform to roles that suffocate individuality and spirit. And most importantly, it highlights an enduring and universal human desire, the profound need for love and personal autonomy. Her life stands as a timeless testament to the idea that no gilded cage, no matter how magnificent, can forever contain the human will to be free. We would love to hear your thoughts on other compelling figures from the Gilded Age, or perhaps your own stories of overcoming societal pressure. Share them in the comments below. And if you are captivated by these tales of history's most fascinating lives, please subscribe for more journeys into the past.